I signed a contract with Sam Spiegel and John Huston, co-partners in Horizon Pictures. I was anxious to work with director John Huston, but unfortunately, he was preparing for his next picture. Joe Losey directed the first one for the partnership. After finishing the film, I was laid low with tuberculosis, and my general state of health did not permit me to return to active work. Those are words from cinematographer Arthur C. Miller. 1951's The Prowler was the last film he ever shot. It's Seeing Faces and Movies is a podcast where each month I focus on the works of a different director or cinematographer, and each week I invite a guest on to discuss a film in the artist's filmography. I'm your host, Felicia, and today we're talking about The Prowler. So a very quick synopsis of the film is, after Susan Gilroy reports a prowler outside her house, police officer Webb Garwood investigates and sparks fly. If only her husband wasn't in the way. Tagline for the film is, "What woman would welcome the prowler?" The film stars Van Heflin as Webb Garwood, Evelyn Keyes as Susan Gilroy, John Maxwell as Bud Crocker, Catherine Warren as Grace Crocker, and Emerson Tracy as William Gilroy. It's written by Hugo Butler, Dalton Trumbo, Robert Thorin, and Hans Wilwin. Cinematography by Arthur C. Miller. Directed by Joseph Losey. Edited by Paul Weatherwax. Music by Lynn Murray. And costumes by Maria P. Donovan. Today I have back on the show Darragh McGrath, who has been on now a multitude, some might say too many episodes. For those, just a recap, we've done Ace in the Hole, Billy Wilder, Straight Time, Ula Grosbar, that was a special features episode. We've done Minnie Moskowitz, Cassavetes, and then Tarnished Angels, Douglas Sirk, which was 2 series ago at this point. And typically I don't have guests on that quickly, but this is partly also an apology episode because I know that the edit on that episode, there were some errors. That happens when you research, record, edit your own show. Some errors happens. You're tired. But this is an apology. Hopefully we can make it up with The Prowler, but thanks for coming back on.
You're welcome. Yeah. I think using AI to as a replacement for me in the last episode was maybe the how it was a little controversial.
Maybe I should have used AI.
That actually might have been shorter. Yeah.
For the listener, I need you to know, if you don't know this about me, I am very much anti-AI. So his promotion of AI, that's not an affiliate of the show.
So does this? Am I? Once you get to like a certain amount of episodes, you're kind of a co-host, basically. Is that how this works?
Or yeah, no, we can never be co-hosts.
Or maybe some sort of like royalty participation scheme. Okay.
Everyone needs volunteering hours. Everyone should be volunteering their time to good causes.
Yeah.
And if you're not going to help the needy, then you should be helping podcasters, especially women podcasters.
It's a type of social currency, really.
Is it? No one cares about the show or
Here
podcast.
we are to talk about a 1950s film, anyway.
We're here to talk about The Prowler. And we're here to talk about The Prowler through the lens of Arthur C. Miller. But this is a film directed by Joseph Losey. So I do have 2 questions for you. The first, though, keeping on route of this episode in this series, have you seen any other Arthur C. Miller films, any films that he shot outside of The Prowler?
Yeah, I have. I think I've seen all the ones you're covering on this podcast. I've seen How Green Was My Valley and Dragonwyck. All of these I've watched in like probably the last year. And then I actually Prowler was probably the first of his that I watched, which was a while ago. I watched it. I think when I was first getting into like noirs and stuff was the first time I watched it. So I wasn't even really familiar with Van Heflin or anyone like that. Yeah, and then the most recent one I watched was Wee Willie Winky, which was was a Shirley Temple film that I watched because I was at home with my daughter who was ill, and she was kind of lying on me, and it was on my it just kind of lined up next after the previous film because we watched Singing in the Rain, and I had to sit and watch Wee Willie Winky, which actually wasn't as bad as I was fearing. It's a John Ford film, but it's a Shirley Temple film, so it's kind of
Mhm.
odd, and it does have a lot of nice photography in it as well. Actually, it does look really good. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't know. I mean, and maybe I did mention it in my Dragwick episode. He shot a lot of Shirley Temple films.
Yeah, I
So,
did see
and
that when I was looking through.
he had a good relationship with her. Um, I would be remiss to not mention that this is a Joseph Losey film, and I need to point this out because I don't know that you would get this from being a listener of the show, but if you know me personally, or if you're a member of the film club, you know that I'm a huge fan of the director Joseph Losey, and it's kind of wild that this is the first time I've ever covered him on the show. Because I've had people ask me, "When are you doing a Losey series?" And the reason why I haven't is because I'm like, I don't know for people who are have seen more than just like one of his films. I would love to do a series, and I'm still okay with having done The Prowler outside of a series on him because I for sure have 4 other films that I could talk about outside of The Prowler because I like this movie, but it's not a Losey favorite. Um,
Mhm.
it is still a good film. Wondering if you're a fan of Joseph Losey and what your relationship is with his work.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think The Servant was the first, which you recommended to me. I think that was the first of his films that I saw. And I mean, that's, one of the best films of the 60s, probably, I would say. And he's
Of
a
all
really
time.
interesting, of maybe of all time, yeah. And he's a really interesting guy. He's a really interesting director. He was blacklisted and it still had a really great career after being blacklisted. But the films that he made in Hollywood are all kind of, they're sort of like studio films, but they're sort of with an interesting, which is The Prowler is very much one of those, with some really interesting themes and like very kind of a lot more thematic weight than you would usually get. I think it's in some of these kind of plots that you would get in like wars and stuff like that. And yeah, I've seen a good few of his films now, including the remake of M, which is actually quite good. And I think it got
Very
blasted for
good.
just not being, the original, but it's actually its own thing, and it's got some really good stuff in there, including a very strong ending and everything like that. And then he did. I think it's just he's kind of been hard to. His films were never. They were kind of hard to find, right? I mean, up until recently, they were kind of hard to find anyway. And I know Criterion did The Servant, and somebody else has released it too.
Yeah,
But a lot of his
BFI.
British films and was it BFI, yeah. And he did Ava, which is one that we got recently. I think that was by Indicator. I thought that was really good. He did Mr. Klein. I think somebody's done Mr. Klein, which is the one with what's the actor's name? And
And I don't know,
yeah,
but I don't know. I thought for some reason that was maybe it's been on Criterion Channel. I do want to talk
yeah.
about his history a little bit in a little bit. So I'm glad that you prefaced it. But yeah, he is very, very, very much an underrated director, and I think that for the average cinephile, I don't want to say the average film watcher because the average film watcher has likely never seen any of his films.
Mm,
But the average cinephile, he's not a name, really. Unfortunately, maybe outside of The Servant, and still people are like, I need to watch The Servant, but they don't know who directed it. And then once they realize, then they go on and see he's done a lot of stuff. He did a lot of stuff. He did some stuff with Liz Taylor also, and Richard Burton, but his work with Dirk Bogarde is once he got to Europe is absolutely fantastic. That's a great partnership that I definitely want to save because I want to expand on that once I finally get to a Lozi series. But we'll as they say, circle back to it.
I think he's probably a lot of people might know him from The Boy with Green Hair, which was I think a
I
lot
don't
of
know if they
people
know
saw with
his direct.
kids. Well, no, they wouldn't think of him as like they might have seen that
Yeah.
film though growing up or whatever and seeing it on TV. And it's kind of a famous film, I guess, because it was they talk about that in the context of the blacklist and stuff like that. And it is worth pointing out that he was a proud communist and was
Mhm.
it wasn't like they were accusing him and he was saying I'm not a communist. He was an actual full blown
Mhm.
believer in communism, and he talks about that a lot in his biography, or no, it was an interview book that I read of his, and about how these are his values and this is what he believes and stuff like that. I mean, he didn't like what was going on in Russia at the time, but he did believe in that system, or that political philosophy, I should say, not system.
Yeah, which is interesting. Again, we'll get back into it because the main writer of this film was probably one of the most popular or known blacklisted people
Hmm.
on the HUAC list. So I'll save that information because we're gonna come back to it in a couple heartbeats here. But getting into the film, we will talk about Arthur C. Miller's stamp on the Prowler.
Hmm.
But I feel like we have to not necessarily talk about the plot because I'm really hoping that if you're listening to this episode, you have seen The Prowler. Please go just watch it. It's really not a long film at all. It's very easy. And if you know me and you can't find it, I will very much send it to you. But The Prowler, I do want to say a fun fact before I get into anything else because this is really cool. Just doing my research. So the assistant director on this film is none other than Robert Aldrich.
Oh,
And
really? Yeah.
for the film nerds, Robert Aldrich is obviously a huge name because he made an insane amount of movies. Namely, like probably the most popular would be Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. But I would say he's done a huge amount of fantastic films. But this is before he became the Robert Aldrich that was at the time. So what he did though on this set specifically was that he built like a flexible, lightweight crane for Miller's camera so that he could swoop through the set. Miller wasn't technically used to because I do recommend that you go back and listen to, especially probably the Dragon Wick episodes where I give a bit more history on Miller, but he started in the very, very, very early ages of silent cinema when films were being distributed in a very like DIY way and films were being made in a very DIY way. And swooping cameras and crane shots were just not really a thing of the time. But at this point in the '50s, they became a thing, and this is, like, really his first time kind of working with something so mechanical. So, I think it's interesting that, 1, Robert Aldrich was the assistant director, but also that he had a hand in, like, building a crane for this movie, which is wild, so that's really cool.
Yeah, I think if you look at like How Green Was My Valley and you see it's kind of almost like such composed, like photographic shots and, linked together, which is like obviously the way they used to do it. And then this film, you do notice that it's set, inside such a contained area at the first half anyway. And he is going through the rooms and following the actors. And it's not something that was like, if you watch a lot of films from that period, it's not something that you would have seen a lot. They're usually quite static. So, stay. If you look at something like Laura or something like that, just very static shots and just like cutting, cutting, cutting. And then this one has, you kind of get a sense of the house that they're in and stuff like that, the rooms that they're in, and he kind of moves from one room to another without cutting, and that is something kind of new for this kind of film, particularly a film that isn't like a high budgeted,
Yes.
expensive, Citizen Kane type, avant-garde, not avant-garde, but big budget sort of spectacle film or whatever you want to say.
Yeah, it is. I'm glad that you mentioned it is. It was definitely a lower budget film for this, and I'll get into how he even got onto this film. But and I kind of mentioned it in the intro actually. But he was excited to work on like a lower budget film because at this point in his career, he had already won 3 Oscars and he'd been nominated for 6, including the 3 that he won. So he's not like a nobody who's just been working for ages, but doing job to job. He's being hired for a reason. But it had been a while since he'd worked on something that wasn't like a huge Hollywood production.
Mhm.
So it was interesting to him. He was very excited to be able to just go back to the basics, but to the basics that were modernized versus where he started, which is very much the basics. But this was like the basics of where they were in the 50s. So I will also I keep saying I'll talk about this later, but I'll talk about how this was his last film that he ever shot. But before that, you kind of mentioned a bit of history on Losey and the history on this film. Joseph Losey, as you said, was blacklisted by HUAC for being an actual communist. He wasn't just accused of it and happened to not be. He was accused of it and happened to actually be a communist. But he released one other film, or he did one other film right after this, but it was released in the same year. So it was obviously just scheduling that this wasn't the last film, but this is the last year that he was in Hollywood before he was essentially forced to move to Europe and make what some people, especially Losey fans, would probably say his best work going
Mhm.
to Europe. Why this is important, I think, to this film is because I think his disdain for authority, his disdain for American ideals is very prevalent in this film. And he didn't write this film, but he's working with someone who was also very much accused of being a communist, and that was Dalton Trumbo, who was one of the writers on this film. At this point, he was already blacklisted, Trumbo, so he had to write under another name, and his name wasn't, obviously associated with this film at all. But I think that you can see those ideals coming through the story very much. And I think for Miller, reading his book, I don't think that he was a communist at all. And I don't know that he was I don't think he was either. I don't think he was anti-communist either because I think he knew very much who he was working with and he could have said no. I think that he was on the left and open to ideals, and I think they worked really well together. So you're working with a bunch of men who are pushing forward thoughts, especially in the 50s, that are not the thoughts that you would see typically in the 50s of like, this is the American life. You have to have your two-parent household, 1 to 2, 1.5 kids, and you're supposed to be looking to ensure that you have money and make your way up in society.
The American dream. I do think that like the people understood the kind of power of cinema at the time and power of films, and including the governments of the world who all hired people to do propaganda and during the war and stuff like that. And in the 50s, the U.S. government did want most films to at least reflect American values or what they perceived as American values. And you had people that the whole accusation of the blacklisting stuff was that they were injecting sort of ideologies that were counter to the American way or whatever. And a lot of them were just humanist sort of philosophies of, take care of people, maybe people should like work together to, there was a lot of like union type films about like forming unions and stuff like that. And there's a lot of films where the unions are the good guys and the bad guys are like the kind of rich people who are trying to break them up and stuff like that. And, that the blacklist whole thing was about trying to undo that, try to undermine that, and try to make, Hollywood films more sort of just about, they can be entertaining, but they have to sort of, the bad guy gets punished at the end or whatever, which this film does, to be fair. It is interesting that he agreed to do this film with one person who was, as you said, was already blacklisted, and another person who, must have known that he was not going to be be able to escape this what would you call it, manhunt?
He, from again reading his book, and if you're this is the only episode you're listening to, the book I'm referencing is a book that he co-wrote with director, cinematographer, producer of especially only the silent era, and who took him under his wing. Fred Balshofer, they co-wrote a book about their experiences in early cinema, going up until, especially for Miller, going up until the Prowler. Like he talks about his work on his last film. So this is obviously written after, but it's called One Reel a Week. It's not widely available, but I did mention in the last two episodes it was released by the University of California Press. And if you just Google it, you can find a used copy out there. And it is also available digitally if you just want to read it on whatever device you might have. But I was lucky to get a physical copy, and it was a very, very, very good read. So highly, highly recommend. But I personally have mixed feelings about this being his last film, only for two reasons. One, because this was not intended to be his last film. So I mentioned this in his own personal quote in the intro, that he signed a contract with Sam Spiegel and John Huston, who were producing and making films together. And so he signed on to shoot a bunch of John Huston films. That was the goal. And he was very excited to work with John Huston because he liked the direction that Huston was going in. When he signed on, Huston was already in preparation for a previous film he had signed on to do before he was going to make his own films for Horizon Pictures. So he didn't get to work with Huston right away. But Sam Spiegel's like, I had this other film called The Prowler, and Joseph Losey's directing. So he's like, yeah, I'll do it. Then he got sick with tuberculosis. That's a bad disease even in the 50s to have, but
Yeah.
he never fully recovered from it, and he could just not go back to work. He still was very much involved in the film industry. He was the president of the American Cinematographers Society, but he just couldn't shoot. He couldn't be on sets and shoot work. So The Prowler ends up being his last film because I think it shows very much who he is. But then I have mixed feelings because I think The Prowler shows him adapting to a new world, because I think The Prowler is so different from The Gunfighter, where The Prowler is moving into what cinema was about to become and then was adapted from that. So it's interesting, and that's why I wanted to do this film, because I didn't need to do The Prowler. Realistically, I could have done another film of his, but I thought it was important to do an episode on his very last film because of all those things. I know you've also seen The Gunfighter. It's probably been a while since you've seen it, but
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, the gunfight is more of what you would maybe. I mean, there is a lot of like stuff happening in rooms in the gunfighter too. I mean, there's that
it's
kind of,
mostly Abrams.
yeah. So I do think it's the Prowler is an interesting bridge between maybe what he was doing and what he maybe would have done. I mean, if he was going to start working with John Huston, he was probably gonna. There's probably going to be some interesting stuff happening. And I do think the Prowler is a sort of him maybe testing the waters of what his new look would be, or his new process would be. And I think you can see that a little bit. I like the Prowler a lot. I think and I haven't rewatched it. I was more maybe impressed by it just because it feels like on paper it's such a traditional kind of just almost forgettable like noir. But there's so much going on underneath, and the way it's shot is kind of really interesting, and the way he shoots it, and the way he ties it into the low seas themes and Trumbull's themes, I suppose, as well. They do complement each other really well, and you see that where at the end, in the second half of the film, or maybe the end of the film, I should say, when they're outside and they're out in the kind of desert, that deserted ghost town, and it still feels very. It feels like they're trapped at the same time, like they weren't, they're trying to escape when they're in the house. They're kind of they start having their affair, and a lot of stuff happens just within that house, within like one room, one or two rooms, and then the end of the movie when they're out in the wide open and they're free, it feels like they're more contained almost. And I think that's a very difficult thing to kind of achieve, and seeing a cinematographer and a director and a writer working together in kind of unison towards that one theme is you get a lot more of that in the 60s and 70s. Then that's what cinema becomes, American cinema becomes.
There's a few things that you mentioned, and you've mentioned this a few times, and I want to point out because it's in my notes. I had this thought that there was an article but the idea of this film being a noir. So
Yeah.
I bring this up because I think it's interesting to bring up, especially as we consider Arthur C. Miller's on this work on this film. So I bring this up, but film noir, it's obviously not just one thing. It has branched off into a multitude of things. But I think a lot of films, we see this with Westerns also, they get lumped into the genre. Like we watched something like Shenandoah, lumped into Western genre. There are Western elements. Is it a Western film? That's debatable. I think
No.
with the Prowler, it gets lumped in as a noir. But is it a noir? I think it's debatable. I personally don't view it as a noir at all. I think there's
It's not.
maybe some noir elements, there's thriller elements, but I don't view it as a noir. So I was glad to see at least one person kind of validate that it's just like I gets lumped into this because these characters are doing something conniving. But if we think about what the essence of a noir is, a film noir is a film noir because of the way it's shot. There are obviously themes and elements, sometimes there's detectives, sometimes there's not. It usually is a crime element. There is a crime element in this film. Heflin's character, Webb, shoots her husband and kills him and had every intention to do so. That doesn't necessarily make a noir. And I bring that up because, and it does tie into the trademarks section that I have in this film. So I don't want to expand too much on it. The quote that he himself said, but I think that this film is very much not shot like a noir. I think it's very shot harshly and very matter of factly. I think that just because there is a police officer and there's a crime doesn't make it a film noir. And I get why people lump it into that, but I don't personally view it as that. And I do want to expand on the way he specifically shoots Van Heflin in this movie because I think it's very noteworthy. But I do want to ask your thoughts on, because you did call it a noir. I'm not, saying, oh, you're considering it a noir, but I know why you're saying that. What your thoughts are on the idea that it may not be.
I think aesthetically it's not a noir at all. But I guess when you kind of think about noirs, thematically they're all about the dark underbelly of American society, and that's kind of how that lumps in a whole lot of films. Really, it's a crime drama, but I mean, it's just that doesn't sound as easy to parse. Just the idea that it's a corrupt cop who is predatory, using his authority and his power to sort of get what he wants, to steal a person's wife or to have an affair or to because initially it's kind of, you think that's what's going to happen, and then it's kind of like she's kind of like, no, she's kind of going along with it, and it's like, okay. And noirs generally were considered sort of any film that undermines or shows a darker side of traditional American life, so marriage, jobs, authority, and stuff like that. Thematically, that's all in there, but aesthetically, it's not a noir really at all. It doesn't have any of the visuals that you would expect from it. So I think it's using kind of, I suppose what you would say is, the kind of novels of Jim Thompson and stuff like that. Those kind of crime novels where everybody's just kind of like a bad person. Pulp kind of stories, and it's more like that. It's more like a crime pulp film.
Well, yeah, pulp is a good way of describing it because I think it's early pulp. I do want to talk about the way he shoots Van Heflin in this movie because I know both you and I have seen a lot of Van Heflin movies, probably more than the listener. And if you're a listener who's like, no, I've seen every Van Heflin movie, I'd love to talk to you because that's fantastic. But Van Heflin's not a name nowadays. I'm sure he was in the time, but if you're someone who likes film, especially film of that era, you definitely have seen multitude of Van Heflin's names.
Mhm.
And at some point, you might become a fan of Van Heflin, or you're just like, oh, it's that guy. I know that I'm a fan of Van Heflin. I know that you are as well. And he has been the lead in a lot of films, a multitude of films in different genres. And I don't know if it's like his face or his personality, but he's often shot like a nice guy, even when he's not.
Yeah.
And I bring that up because Possessed, which is a Curtis Bernhardt film, it's not shot by Arthur Miller, but he's the lead in that. And his character is nasty in that film, but he's not shot in a nasty way. He's shot in the way that you want to kind of feel sorry for him or be on his side, which some people might be. Personally, I'm not. I know that you love his character and Possessed, and
On his
he's
side.
your
I don't think
hero.
people want to be on his side and Possessed. I just think
I
he's
mean,
funny.
you do.
He's very cruel and he's kind of sharp. He's got a sharp tongue, I would say. Yeah, that's the writer, really.
No, but like,
Um,
I don't think even that, I don't even think he's cruel. He is,
mm,
but like, I think if you're a human being who's maybe been in that situation or you're a woman, you probably feel more of the pang of the what he's doing, which is
yeah,
gaslighting. But in The Prowler, especially with the rewatch, this is the first time because again, the first time I watched The Prowler would have been early in my Van Heflin days. I think again, I'd seen him in Possessed, so I knew his name at that point because I had such a visceral reaction to him and his character in Possessed that I was like, "Who is this? Who is this?" And I remember started watching more of his movies, just like, "Oh, Van
yeah.
Heflin's in this, so watch it." So Possessed happened to be on the list, but rewatching it, I was like, "Oh, he's shot in a way that you were never going to be on his side." He's from the moment you see his face, it's so dark and sinister, but it's not pointing him out to be like this mass, villain, like this huge villain. It's just like, this is someone that you cannot trust. And I think that probably has some more undertones and
Hmm.
elements in it, but I think that it's very interesting the way that Miller decided to shoot his character in this movie because at no point, and I think it's very much tied into Losey's vision and Trumbo's vision of a character like this, that you cannot trust a human being like that. Wondering how you feel about someone who knows Van Heflin and the way he's typically portrayed in films and how he's portrayed in this film.
I mean, I think a lot of people would know him probably from Shane. Would be the would be the big one, if you're like into old westerns and Treat Them to Yuma, yeah, where he's playing kind of a heroic figure, but he plays like an everyman, so much schlubby maybe isn't a word, but a kind of everyman, often like the weaker of the two. If there's often another man in the film that is like that he's sort of defined against, he's really the kind of leading man hero character, and he's sort of, I guess, soft. He's often shot that way, lit that way. In this film, especially when he's wearing his cop uniform and stuff like that, the way they shoot him from like underneath. He's looking down almost. They really accentuate his kind of. He's got these like cheekbones and high, like deep set eyes, and he does look very menacing, and he looks like you know, he kind of looks sadistic a lot of the time. And I think what he's doing is somewhat sadistic as well. So he's very menacing in the film, even though, I mean, I don't know how imposing he was. I don't know how tall he was or anything like that, but he's not a big guy. He's not like a big, tough looking guy. So the way that they shot him, especially in that first half, and then you kind of notice in the second half, it becomes more, he's a little bit more desperate and pathetic and stuff like that, because he's lost his society power, which was, the power he had as a police officer, where he was able to get away with murder and he's able to get away with doing the things that he did. And then he kind of sheds those things, and he's kind of, he's being outplayed a little bit by Evelyn Keyes and things like that. But yeah, I think the way they shoot him is to sort of show that he is an everyman, and that can be a scary thing too, I guess, is sort of the underlying theme. Is that, I mean, he starts the movie, he's like the sidekick cop or whatever. The
Mhm.
he's not the most senior, he's the junior cop in the duo. And that guy is more kind of father figure sort of type, kind of what simple isn't the right word, but the guy's very straightforward. His boss or whatever, his partner's very straightforward, and just like a practical, nice guy. And then he's Van Heflin is like very much out to get what he wants, and he sees something that he wants, and he just starts moving things around in order to get it. Yeah, and I think the way the camera follows him, you often have sometimes you have the camera to the back of him, and then you see the other person in the kind of background looking at him and stuff like that. So there is this constant sort of, he is a threat to whatever situation he's in, especially at the beginning.
Yeah.
And it's unusual for Van Heflin. You might, back then you might have gotten to see the film with his name and you think, well, he's going to be,
the nice guy,
or the not so, he'll see the error of his ways or something like that. That's definitely not what's happening in this.
No, I mean, very much not. Yeah, it's interesting. And again, if you haven't watched this movie, I highly recommend you do. But essentially, the crux of it is that Evelyn Keyes' character she's taking a shower and she sees someone kind of watching her outside. She calls the cops. The cops who come, one of them happens to be Webb Garwood, played by Van Heflin. And they're kind of looking around. They're not really taking it seriously because they just assume, this is a woman who is alone and is just a little freaked out by being alone and heard, a ruffle in the outside of her house and is freaking out. Essentially calling her, I don't want to say as far as hysterical, but just overreacting to the situation. So they're not taking that seriously.
And then sorry, and then Van Heflin kind of has more of the idea that, well, she's calling us because she's like wants, she wants the attention or whatever like that. There's a kind of a darker undercurrent of his perception of the events is always like cynical, I guess. He's got this cynicism about everybody, and he's like, she's calling us because she wants us to come, see her in distress or whatever it is.
There's that, and there's also the element that they do have history together. Not necessarily personal history, but they do know each other. They went to the same school.
Right, yeah.
He was a big, football player at the time in his school, and she was probably a popular girl, but maybe a little bit, like, a couple years older, younger than him. But it seems though he remembers her and she's remembers him, but not by sight. It wasn't until they exchanged names, at least on her end, that she remembers who he is. So there is that history, and that kind of ties into one of the last questions I have. But Heflin, and this is a side note because I was doing some Googling, as you mentioned, in terms of his stature, he was 5'10". And you said, he doesn't seem that tall. And I'm like, I know you are also 5'10", and I agree. That's not a tall man. He's not overbearing. He's not,
he's of an
he's just
acceptable
average height.
Yeah.
So he's not someone intimidating others, as one might say. But I think that it is interesting the way he shoots him in that film. And I think another element to this film that I find very interesting, especially knowing Miller's background in Westerns, because the early eras of film, a lot of the films shot were Westerns. And I think the Western sensibility comes a lot through this film. I'm not going to say that this film is a Western because it's not, but I think that every film, best film, adapts things from other genres in the way it see fits. So there's a couple of things in this film that I think he's bringing in his history of shooting Westerns, especially in silent film, that come through here. The first one is like the scene between Webb and William, Webb being Heflin's character and William being Evelyn Keyes' character, Evelyn Keyes' husband character, when they have their first standoff, because for a long time we don't get to see her husband because he's a radio host and we're seeing them at night when he's working. So we're not going to see him. The first time we do see him, they have essentially a standoff outside, very much like a Western standoff. And, Webb ends up shooting him. Now, his goal was to claim it as self-defense.
Mhm.
We know from following his character because he is the main character. I think sometimes if the film sometimes tries to paint Evelyn Key's character or Susan as the protagonist, but I think it's Webb. Garwood is the protagonist. To be honest, I think we're following him a lot more than we're following her. The film is never, at one point, is never trying to trick you into believing that there's a twist or that he's going to switch things up. We know what he's going to do. And when he does it, we're not surprised because we've been following him. So I think there's that element. But then also, once we get to now, the husband's dead, they've gotten married, and they realize that she's pregnant because this situation, the case was in the news. They're like, we can't have you just say you're pregnant and people know because they're going to realize that we've been together before this. And that maybe the case is going to reopen. So they go to a safe house essentially out in the Western Valley of California. And the way that's shot is so, so different than most of the film because a lot of the film, as you said, was indoors, it's at night, and we're now getting a lot of outdoor shots during the day and very desert shots.
I think it works really well. Yeah, I think it does sometimes feel like the film is a little kind of, as much as they're doing things like moving the camera from room to room, it does get a little, you can't keep doing this. So they have to get out of the house basically. And it works within the film story and the film, what the film is trying to say as well. And I really like that the way they shoot that ghost town at the end, where it's, and this big, what is it, a storm kicking up? It's like a tornado almost. It's just blowing everything away. And it's the idea that these guys, this couple have finally got what they wanted to a certain degree. They got their freedom and everything like that, but they're trapped by their own actions. And it's quite, it is shot more like a Western. You have like maybe just because it's in the desert, sort of that vibe. And there's some guns.
I think in the last episode I did, How Green is My Valley, I kind of talked about one of the trademarks as being how good he is at shooting indoors. And it actually is relevant to this film. And I hadn't pointed that out really, but it is, again, relevant in the next film I'll cover. So I'll save it for that. But once he does get in the outdoor space, I think that it brings a great, essentially climax to the film. I think this film is kind of maybe forgotten because it feels so of the 50s and a lot of films were
Mm-hmm.
like this, but this is an early vision of what the 50s crime and probably, noir films
Mm-hmm.
were to become. So I think it's often dismissed, which is unfortunate, but that's what it is. I do have one question that's outside of the cinematography realm for you, and I'll pass it off to you actually after that to see if there's anything about the film that we haven't mentioned, and we'll go back to it in the third segment. But one of the questions I have, just from rewatching it, because as I said, it had been a long time, but I'm wondering what you think. Do you think Webb was the original Prowler? Was he creeping on her?
I was going to ask you that. I was like, did they ever establish who,
No.
or even if it was happening? I mean, it was. She doesn't really. I guess she does bring it up again. Actually, she does say that there was some.
No, she does. She does.
Yeah,
And I do believe that there was someone out there. She could have been creeped out, but I don't think that she would have
called the cops.
called the cops if it was just like a
Yeah,
one-off thing. I think there was very much someone out there, but the film never says who it was, and we never see it. We all just know that he's now creeping on her, essentially. I'm wondering if you think that he was the first person out there.
I think the first time I watched it, that's what I thought.
So did I.
The second time I was like, does that make sense though? Because he's got the partner with him and they're literally
Mhm.
on patrol, so it doesn't really make any sense. But then as you mentioned, they knew each other. He knew who she was. Is there an element that he knows, that he was stalking her or something like that? Some kind of, that he's had a thing for this woman for a long time, and that maybe whatever he saw her before this film started and knows where she lives and all this kind of stuff. So I think the films that, yeah, they never really establish who the Prowler was. I mean, I guess I'm not even sure if you're supposed to assume it was Ben Affleck. Yeah, they have that great scene at the beginning where he becomes the Prowler. The cops
Yeah.
are looking around and he sneaks up on the window and spooks her.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely like you. The first time, I also thought that he was the Prowler, but rewatching it, I was like, it doesn't necessarily make sense. But then, like the time between her calling them and them getting there, we don't really know how much time. And this is again
No, that's true.
the 50s. It's not like they're in a small town, so they're in a big town. So obviously, there's a lot of cops on duty.
Yeah.
So I don't. It could have taken like 5 minutes for them to get there.
I don't know how like cops do I mean, it might have been that the cops were like on patrol, so they were both taking a street or something like that. You know what I mean? And
I don't
we're
know.
just
That's
kind of
the
adding
thing.
things that weren't really established in the film. But
I don't know. I think it's interesting, and I like that they never establish who it is because it's like that means there's still like a prowler
yeah,
lurking
well,
in the area.
the idea, I guess, it establishes the feeling that just you've got your nice American wife and your nice comfortable home, and your husband went out and you're in danger.
Yep.
Which is the sort of the beginnings of a lot of these kind of films, and it would go in a more traditional route where he was the prowler, and he would get caught at the end and get shot or something like that. This movie goes into a different direction when they actually start having an affair, and she kind of
Mm,
gives into, which again at the beginning you do not think she's going to do. At least I didn't think. She's very virtuous or whatever like that, and then she sort of gives into it, and it's kind of an interesting, and it also, we haven't talked about it much, but she's basically a woman who's just been left alone in the house.
mhm.
She wasn't given, she wanted kids. She wasn't, they weren't able to have kids. I can't remember the reason, if he just didn't want them or something like that.
I
Didn't
think
want
it
them,
was
or
just they were not
they were
unable
not.
physically to
Yeah.
do.
So she's sort of going through this sort of, um, like really fundamental, like life shift, that she's not happy about, and has nobody to talk to, and she has to listen to her husband whining on the, droning on the radio all the time, uh,
Mhm.
and it is forced to sit and listen to it every night, which is kind of, they do kind of suggest that the husband is also kind of keeping her there like a
Yeah.
pet or something like that, that he's not very nice. So she sees an out, I guess, with Van Heflin, even though he's just another version of the same thing.
It's so interesting you mentioned that he's keeping her there, and she's droning on about, I want this and that because this is not Arthur C. Miller related. This is Joseph
Hmm.
Losey related. Before we get into the second segment, but I do want to say this because I think it's interesting. Despite being a fan of him and being a little disappointed in this, but like try not to judge people on their personal lives. It has nothing to do with me. He didn't write this film, but I think still as a director, you have the authority to direct a story in a way. You can take a script and you can emphasize certain things with the way you shoot things. And he's obviously working with Arthur C. Miller on that. Prior to shooting The Prowler, he's been married, Joseph Losey, and the wife wants kids. They get pregnant. She has a miscarriage. The wife is obviously very upset and distraught about this, and it's all she can talk about. Joseph Losey decides he can't handle this. So his way of handling it is by working, which is fair. A lot of people are like, I just want to be distracted by work. He is working on a film where, pregnancy is involved and they had to decide, this is not the right time. How are we going to go about this? And dealing with a woman, prior to that, her character, as you said, really wanted to have kids and couldn't have kids. And it's interesting. It's sad, unfortunately. He did have an affair with Evelyn Keyes on this set, Joseph Losey.
Oh, really?
Evelyn Keyes, who's with none other than John Huston, who was one of his production company is managing this film.
Yeah.
So, I guess it's a good thing that Joseph Losey but Arthur C. Miller is kind of in the middle of all
Hmm.
this situation. That's just a little tidbit and note. We'll get back into it because I do wanna talk we'll talk about our last thoughts, anything that we might have forgotten in this first segment once we get back to segment 3, the trademarks. But quickly, I wanna get into segment 2, which is before and after. To just to give to the listener some frame of context of where Miller was in his career at this point. So, if you've been listening along, you know that at this point he's at the end of his career, and this is someone who started from the 1910s. He started his career at 14 years old. Anyway, this film, The Prowler, was released 1951. As we know with a lot of films, sometimes you can shoot a film years before it gets released later, but we're just talking about the release dates. So 1951 is The Prowler. 1950, he shoots The Gunfighter,
Mhm.
directed by Henry King. He'd previously worked with Henry King on a film called The Song of Bernadette in 1943, and that's where he won his second Oscar. I've seen that film. It is good. It's very virtuous and
Well,
very
about nuns, right?
religious. Yeah, she's essentially, what's that woman's name? What's that big woman who was a nun who kind of had visions? I don't know if it's based on her. What's her
Uh,
name? I don't know. There's like
Mother
a,
Teresa.
yeah, Mother
Oh,
Teresa.
okay,
Yeah,
okay.
she's a
So,
Mother Teresa
yeah,
esque character. I remember thinking I watched it not because of Arthur C. Miller. I watched it because I like Henry King a lot. And I like Jennifer Jones when she's not doing brown face, because for some reason she was cast in a lot of films where she was playing
yeah.
either a Mexican or something that wasn't white.
Well, you do it once, and then you're caught.
Anyway, she's obviously very good in it. Like, I'm pretty sure she won an Oscar for that film, deservedly so. And the film itself feels very much like something you would watch in school if you go to Catholic school, as
Mm.
a lot of us had the misfortune of doing. But what I remember the most about it was how beautiful it looked, because it's insane the way that film looks. And I do recommend that film for people who are like, I want to see something that's just beautiful of the time, and beautiful black and white photography. So I remember at that point, I knew Arthur C. Miller's name, but I remember when opening credits and seeing his name, I was like, okay, I'm in for a good ride. And I understand why he won the second Oscar for it. So that's what he does right before that. The Gunfighter, I don't want to get too much into the plot because that is the next episode on this film. So I'll be discussing that. But there is no after for The Prowler. As you mentioned, The Prowler is the last film that he does, and it's not because he retired and was like, "This is the end of my career," which would have been very much valid because at this, like I said, he'd been working since the 1910s, and this is 1951 at this point. That's a long career for someone who started so early and very much could have retired. This is just thinking about the difference in those films, which will tie into the third segment, but wondering what your, not even necessarily Arthur C. Miller's work, but I know what your thoughts are
Mhm.
on The Gunfighter, because it's not a film I still think it's a very much underseen and undervalued film.
I think it's just like a very, I guess, could be construed as just a very traditional Western. It's kind of like, it's just done very well. You got great performances, a great story, shot really well, and it's just it's very quite fast paced from what I remember when I watched it. I remember feeling like I don't know, I can't remember how long it was, but I think
It's
it was like
85 minutes.
okay, so it's pretty short too. But
Yeah.
the pacing is really good in the film, and it takes all of the sort of ingredients that you would expect from a Western and just sort of like, not that it necessarily does anything like massively different, but it's everything is just kind of on the higher end of 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 the um of the genre. Um,
Mhm.
it's just like a really good, solid Western, I guess. If you wanted to get people into the genre to be like, this is, it's not a revisionist kind of thing. It's not trying to do something new. Uh, but it's just like a really good story, well told. And
Yeah.
everything is in service to the story. I think that's something that he was quite good at. Or Arthur C. Miller. Um, that he was just, it was always in service to the story, even the
Mhm.
visuals. Yeah. How Green Was My Valley is the one. I didn't love it. I thought it was kind of boring, but it looks amazing. And I think That's
It's
the
worth
film
a
where maybe he
rewatch.
was like, I need to like, it needs to at least look amazing. I thought, I know you said you liked it on the rewatch. You liked it more on the rewatch, but
I liked it a lot more on the rewatch, and it's funny because it is not to like hop on this because I know we want to move to the third segment, but it's interesting. His I think the best cinematographers are someone who are great collaborators and they adapt to the vision of the director. That being said, the director or whoever, the producer is hiring them because a lot
Mhm.
of times this is what I know you have to offer. How can we work together? Someone like a John Ford is different than Henry King, is different than Joseph Losey. Those are three directors who are not even remotely like one another. So I think the way he shoots How Green Was My Valley is so John Ford. I feel like I
Mhm.
mentioned it in my last episode, feels very clinical. It feels very matter of fact, but it's still beautiful. And then the way Joseph Losey is directing his film has a darker undertone that is not seen in John Ford films. I don't think John Ford films are dark. And Henry King is someone who I think is the very much the middle ground of both those directors. So I think it's great the way he adapts. But I do want to talk about in the third segment one trademark that I noticed and that I was glad I got to get a quote from him. So I'll open it with a quote and then we can discuss that and what your thoughts are on it. But he says the basic principle I have had in making pictures was to make them look real life and then emphasize the visuals slightly. I was never a soft focus man. I like the focus to be very hard. I like crisp and hard, solid images. And I thought that was very interesting to bring up with this movie specifically, because we think about noirs and soft focus and how hard imagery is not often seen in noirs. You might see it in thrillers, so you might see it in crime dramas, but in noirs it's not. That's why I brought up why I
Mhm.
don't personally think this film is a noir. But obviously, it has crime or a noir elements through the story, but visually, it's not a noir. And I think that he very much shoots this like a very real life story. And I think that's why you're so uncomfortable with Heflin's character, is because he very much seems like the type of human being, whether it's a cop or a guy that you're going to for help for whatever reason, and decides that, vulnerable, I can use this to my advantage, but I'm going to
Mhm.
try and be a little bit charming, but also I don't have the actual charm to not be a little bit creepy. So hopefully you're into that. And I think the way he's shot, I know we keep talking about that, and there's a lot of people in this film, but I'm so fascinated by the way Van Heflin is shot in this film, and I think that quote ties into the way he shot this film perfectly because it is very hard, and there's some images that feels very harsh and stark,
Mhm.
without it feeling like it's attacking the audience. It just feels
Yeah.
so different from noir of the time because noir was obviously popularized in the 40s. By the time we're getting to this era of the 50s, this is like kind of where noir is starting to wrap up its run. And I think that's why it's taking the noir genre, crime genre into a new realm. And I think that's why this film is important and undervalued in the genre. So I'm wondering how you feel about him saying outright that I don't I'm not interested in soft focus. I want
Yeah.
things to seem like this is real life that I'm portraying to you.
I do. I think it's interesting that in like the 30s and 40s, I mean, everything was soft focused. That's how you shot, you know, the kind of dream on screen or something. You would always get soft, big lighting, soft focus. And it's interesting that, and then in the later in the 60s, and especially, you get that much more, if it's something like In Cold Blood or something like that, you get kind of that much more what Arthur C. Miller is doing here. I find it interesting he said that having shot so many Shirley Temple films. Um, even though I've only seen one, which was the John Ford one, so that did have the harder lighting. The only times it didn't was when Shirley Temple was like a close up or whatever, and then they would use more like lighting would be more kind of shoot it would brighten when she was on the screen basically, but the rest of the film looked much more like the way the Prowler looks. So yeah, I think it's interesting that he kind of had that viewpoint. I wonder if it's just having gone. I mean, if he started in 19 whatever it was, 14 or whatever, he went through 20s, 30s, 40s where it's all that's how you did it. You went through the studio system. You shot with soft focus a lot of the time.
Hmm.
Um, and he must have just been sick of it. I mean, he must have just been like, well,
Yeah.
cinema's maybe moving it towards where we can move the camera around a lot more, it's lighter. Um, things are going to be more closer to reality than.
Mhm.
I wonder when people watched this film back then, or maybe films a little earlier, how they felt about that sort of visual difference. If it was like that's not how films are supposed to look, or something like that. That you get that these days with some films where the shaky camera, was more of a thing years ago. But that idea that you're kind of in the room with the person, and that was just moving away from the kind of you know professional looking thing. Uh, but yeah, I mean, I think that's he was obviously somebody who was thinking about the future and thinking about where things were going as opposed to where things had been.
Yeah.
And I think he was probably right in thinking, he was right in thinking people are going to be telling stories that are a little bit more not so tied to like the Hays Code or codes of behavior, and they're going to get more sort of dealing with real life issues and real life people, and they're going to have more depth, and that's what we need to kind of push towards. So yeah, it's interesting
Yeah.
that he thought in those terms as well, like in terms of uh, how those things feel more like reality and things like that.
I think that it's exactly that. He's someone who's worked through pre-Hollywood system. Like when he was starting, Hollywood was not a thing. Most people were shooting in New York, and people started moving towards California because they realized the weather was better and they didn't have to deal with, oh, it's, gray and snowing. It was mostly sunny with sometimes rain. So that's why, I mean, I'm not going to give, I'm sorry, the listener a history on Hollywood beginnings. That's for another time. That's for another
It was
podcast to
all it
do.
was all about patents, wasn't it? Wasn't that why they moved to California?
But I like that he was like, I he obviously could shoot soft focus and was willing to do it, but his preference was to not.
Hmm.
So if you're hiring me, someone who at this point at the Prowler, again, I know we all know the Oscars don't mean anything, but they still do. He's a three-time Oscar winner. He's a name who's worked with a huge amount of directors like John Ford, Henry King, and so on. It's like hiring any modern cinematographer that people actually know their name of. You're hiring them because you know what they have to offer. You're not just hiring because you're like, I need someone to shoot this movie. You're He was being hired because he is Arthur C. Miller, so he had a say. As much as he's collaborating with the director, he still had a say. And I think that's why this film is important to include in this series and why this film is important. But I do have any like wondering if you have any last thoughts about the film before I pass it off for the last question that I have for you on the double bill.
I think everyone should probably watch more Joseph Losey films, and
Well,
this is
yeah.
a very interesting film. And I think it's the last film he made, right, in Hollywood. It's a really interesting kind of stepping off point. It's somebody who had some ideas and philosophies that were counter to a lot of what you would get in in classic Hollywood cinema. And I think he had much more modern sensibilities, and I think he had much more things that would modern audiences would be in tune with. I know this isn't about Arthur C. Miller, and this episode is about Arthur C. Miller, but I think if the Prowler is a really interesting point in his career, and it's a really
Mhm.
interesting point in him using the Hollywood system, including a cinematographer like Arthur C. Miller, who was known for things like, I mean, he did like a Zorro film, which was probably his most commercially successful film. He did John Ford films. He did Henry King films. This is a big, he's using Dalton Trumbo. He's using all these kind of, I guess I couldn't say it was him, but he's
Mhm.
using kind of higher end studio people, and he's trying to tell a story that he maybe does better in later years, but it's always things that he plays around with. It's always the themes that he plays around with. And I think the Prowler is it's really good performances. It looks fantastic because Arthur C. Miller shot it. So you're gonna have at least that. And I think there's a few of those famous noirs are kind of, they're not the most. Sometimes they do feel a little dull or static or whatever. And I think this film has a lot more kind of oomph going for it. And
Mhm.
I think it's an interesting film to watch if you want to watch something that's a little bit different than maybe what you're expecting. It might go in a direction you're not quite expecting.
Fully agree with that. But I am interested to hear, before I wrap it up and let you go about your day, what you would pair this film with if you have a double bill in mind,
Yeah,
and why you're pairing those films together. And I really hope that we don't have the same movie.
I very much doubt it. I had a kind of a difficult time with this because I think the last few times I've done this, I've paired it with a film that was kind of similar or whatever. Which
Mhm.
isn't, and then I was listening to your podcast, which I do. I know you don't believe
Yeah,
me.
sure.
And one of the guests was like, well, you should do something that's, it's not, it's good to, if you're doing an actual double bill, it's good to do something that's quite different. And I kind of agreed with that. So I wanted to make a film that had a similar theme, which was a film
Okay.
about people getting what they want, but feeling it not working out and it making them feeling more trapped. So the film I picked was The Heartbreak Kid with
Mm,
Charles Grodin, directed by Elaine
nice.
May. That is a film about a man who is a weirdo, a little bit a creep
Mhm.
to a large degree, and who doesn't know himself. I think Van Heflin knows himself in this film. I think Van Heflin knows he's a bad person in this film, and he's
Yeah.
okay with that. But The Heartbreak Kid is a film about a guy who just always wants something, gets it, and then is somehow worse off for it. And it's a comedy, and it's very entertaining, and it features one of the best comedy scenes ever. But also weirdly hard to find. So that's how those two things are themed. Not It
Yeah.
should not be hard to find, but it is hard to find. So yeah, I picked The Heartbreak Kid because I just thought thematically they have some similarities that might be interesting. They're both short, so you could watch it in an actual double bill.
You could actually do a double
Mm.
bill. No, that would be good, actually. I will never say no to Charles Grodin, that's for sure. The only time I've seen it was in a cinema in Winnipeg. That's the last time I've seen it, so I need to rewatch it. But it's a great time to first see it. It was also that screening was hosted by a member of Kids in the Hall, Kevin. If you're
Oh,
if anyone, there's a lot of Canadian history going into that screening.
huh.
Anyway, my double bill, I've already mentioned this film, and so I was like, "Oh, I really hope that you didn't pick it also," but I think that we talked a lot about Van Heflin in this episode, despite it not being a series or an episode on Van Heflin, but I think that he, again, as we've said, everyone in this film really is kind of undervalued and underappreciated. Van Heflin is very much in that vein, and I think that if you wanna see him also play a nasty character, but isn't necessarily portrayed the same way that he is in this, I would highly recommend Possessed. Curtis Bernhardt directed that. It's also starring one of cinema's greatest artist, Joan Crawford, who you're really watching that film for, because that's
Mm.
definitely why we watched that film. They're not similar in the sense at all. I think one is just kind of like is a playboy, a little bit of a dickhead, but this could give her multiple outs. And he's not a he's not an outright villain like he is in the Prowler. I think that you can argue that he was just like, "Hey, I told you I wasn't interested," but you still want to fight him because
He doesn't have to be like that about it.
I think that shows great range for Van Heflin,
Hmm.
so I wanted to use that as an excuse to promote his work. And again, both short films that you can 100%. I think Possess has got to be like 90-minute range.
Another film that
To
needs a good Blu-ray release.
I know.
Possessed. We have it on DVD. Yeah.
So thanks for coming back on. I promise to edit this correctly. Thanks for coming back on. I really appreciate it. We'll see when the next time you're on. Hopefully, uh,
The
not
Losi
too soon.
episodes.
Yeah,
Although
we'll see
I
about
feel like
that.
I probably said it at this point. Yeah.
We'll
Anyway,
see about
thank you.
that. Anyway, thanks. Seeing Faces in Movies is an official podcast of the Royal Film Club. It's hosted and edited by Felicia with intro music by Lamar Walker. If you like what you heard, let us know at seeingfacemovies.com or send us an email at seeingfacemovies@gmail.com. While you're at it, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to your podcast. And stay tuned for our last episode in the series on The Gunfighter. Watch my movies, and we'll catch you next time.